Walter Lenore was a North Carolina planter who believed he owed everything to the South. He served in the war, and he paid almost everything. We'll find out how when we return on Civil War Talk Radio.
In the great scheme of things, a minute isn't all that much, unless you happen to have a stroke. All of a sudden, those minutes count, minutes that could mean losing your ability to talk, move, or walk, which is why, if you can get help in time, your stroke can be treated. The warning signs of a stroke include sudden numbness or weakness of the face. If you experience this, call 911 immediately. Visit strokeassociation.org or call 1-888-4STROKE today. A public service announcement from the American Stroke Association and the Ad Council.
Looking for answers in real estate? We break it down for you. Each week, the Exeter Group explores how successful investors evaluate and acquire real estate to build their portfolio. From financing tips, tax and accounting strategies, and advice on how to control risk, the Exeter Group entertains and informs while divulging secrets used by the most successful investors. Tune in to the Exeter Group every Monday at 12 p.m. Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern on World Talk Radio, Studio A.
You're listening to World Talk Radio, where the world comes to talk.
Welcome back to Civil War Talk Radio. I'm Jerry Prokopovich, talking today with William L. Barney, author of The Making of a Confederate, Walter Lenore's Civil War, a book about a North Carolina planter who, after supporting the Union, opposing secession, is suddenly transformed by the call for troops that Lincoln issues in 1861, sees it as a threat of invasion, and throws in his lot with the Confederacy with a wholeheartedness that matches his pre-war Union spirit. We've talked about that in the first couple segments, and we're getting at last to Walter Lenore joining the Confederacy. How does he do this, Bill? Does he raise his own regiment? Does he join another regiment?
No. Initially, he didn't. Walter joined as a private. He didn't leave for the front immediately because he was the only one in the family with a legal background that could make sense out of his departed brother's incredibly complex estate. So he was hoping of being able to settle that and sell the land, but of course, in the context of the war and the confusion of the estate, he couldn't. So once he was convinced of that and he got all his affairs in order, Walter was a very regulated, controlled guy and left directions if he were not to return. And Walter, January 1st, 1862, made his way down to the South Carolina coast to join the company that his brother Tom had formed. So he entered the Confederate Army as a private and attached himself to the Haywood Volunteers and spent most of the winter through early March basically teaching himself how to be a soldier. He got out the manual, taught himself from that, learned how to adapt to a quite different diet and the Army, toughened himself up, was very, very proud when he reported back home that he was developing muscles that he didn't know he had and never felt better in his life. I mean, this is clearly a test of manhood. And stayed on the Carolina coast, and this is part of the stationary defense network that Lee had put up after the fall of Port Royal, and thought he would see his first military action when that company was sent into North Carolina to seal off Burnside's invasion. And he came close, but he saw no combat duty in North Carolina. They were stationed around Kinston. And he then discovered that Tom was not going to re-enlist. He now returned to his native county, Caldwell, and raised troops and was elected an officer by the men. And they were trying to attach themselves to a regular command when Zebulon Vance was trying to put together, this is before obviously Vance was governor, Vance was trying to put together what was known as Vance's Legion. So they were sent back in eastern North Carolina for a variety of reasons. Vance's Legion never got off the ground. Walter then, however, discovered that friends of his had secured him a officership in a different regiment, part of Lee's army. Went up to Richmond in late June '62, and very soon would see that combat action that he desperately wanted to have to prove himself.
What regiment was he in then?
North Carolina. Geez, drawing a blank here right now.
Looking at my notes, I want to say 37th, 7th?
37th sounds right. It would obviously be in the index. It was the North Carolina 37th that was attached to Jackson's Corps, composed primarily of troops from western North Carolina.
And they do see the action that he looks for at Second Bull Run.
Yeah. Lee starts to send troops north after McClellan is ordered back to Washington by Lincoln. Walter's company and regiment pull out. His first battle will be the Battle of Cedar Mountain in August '62, when Jackson bloodied the nose of the advancing elements of Pope's army. And it was here that the diary was invaluable. Walter kept the diary. Well, first entries were as soon as he arrived on the Carolina coast, and he has very vivid descriptions of his feelings going into the battle, what he did. Spent most of his time rallying his men, often literally pushing them forward, proving that he wouldn't flinch when the bullets came. And the battle was over. Walter escaped unscathed, and he made the comment, I had to prove to myself that I could do it. I did, and frankly, I don't care if I'm ever in another battle again. But that was hardly to be the case. This was Jackson's Corps, so Jackson drove the men up to eventually what became the Confederate victory at Second Manassas. And Walter's company, along with the regiment, but especially Walter's company, was almost decimated at the first full day's fighting at Second Manassas. We're talking about 2/3 casualties here. Though ironically, once again, Walter was fine. But there's only a nub of the company left. The company was down to about 12-15 men who reported for duty. And in the final stages of the Second Manassas campaign, mainly Lee's attempts to outflank the retreating Pope by using Jackson's Corps, Walter's company took part in what's known as the Battle of Ox Hill, or sometimes the Battle of Chantilly. It was a minor engagement, but it was this battle that resulted in the devastating wound that Walter received. He was resting at twilight, and a Yankee sniper took 2 mini balls. One shattered his shin bone and tibia, and the other his ankle, and knocked off a toe. And again, the diary was incredible. Walter obviously wrote this as soon as he regained consciousness after the operation, but one of the best accounts I've ever written of the reality of experiencing a wound during a Civil War battle. He was wounded about 8 o'clock in the evening. It was a Sunday night, September 4th, I think. Dragged himself to a clearing, desperately trying to get to the rear, but he only exposed himself to many balls and shells from both sides. Fortunately, was then found within a half hour by Confederates who were aware of his wound. They made a makeshift stretcher, blankets, and branches that they had chopped off a tree. He was then carried to a farmhouse about a mile away and placed on the front steps. There wasn't any room in the house because there's so many Confederate wounded in it. And throughout the night, he was in agony. His visitors to the farmhouse were continually kicking him in his shattered leg. He was then taken out to a field, along with hundreds of other wounded Confederates, spent a day and a half out there, and finally was operated on with about 72 hours after the wound. Fortunately, they had chloroform, so the operation was relatively painless. But as soon as he woke up, they loaded him into a farm wagon with no springs and jostled him for 20 miles to Middleton, Virginia. And he described every single jolt of the wagon. It felt as if my stump was being thrust in a molten fire. It's an incredibly vivid account. Gets to Middleburg, and he's dumped in the middle of the street. Fortunately, a minister's wife spotted him, and they were able to make accommodations for him. But it's an absolutely vivid account.
It really is. It's a very vivid is the word. Last week on the show, we had Michael Flannery, who's written a book on Civil War medicine, and he mentioned that many soldiers died not from the amputation, but because they were left in the field too long and gangrene set in. And it sounds like Lenore was fortunate to have the amputation take place.
Yeah, basically the triage, when the physicians or surgeons were to go through the fields, if your wound was in an extremity, you had a pretty good chance of surviving if they amputated in time to prevent gangrene. But head wounds, stomach wounds,
there was nothing they could do.
Next to nothing that they could do. So Walter was found in time, and it was a relatively successful operation, but it was 2 weeks before he could sleep, because he had to sleep on his back in order to let the stump drain, and he just said one of the worst things about this was I could just never get to sleep. But one of the most amazing documents I've ever seen was the first letter that Walter wrote from Middleburg to his brother Rufus back home. And Walter had a very neat handwriting. Was a superb writer. This is a very short letter, and you would think that a 3-year-old had written it. Big, blocky, shaky letters. Rufus, this is Walter. I'm wounded, but I'm alive. Please come and get me.
Wow.
Incredible letter.
Yeah, archival research doesn't sound like all that much fun to the outsider, but once in a while you come across something like that just
something that really makes it worthwhile.
It does. It just brings it to life in your hand right there. Wow. Well, now Walter is eventually brought back and spends the rest of the war in North Carolina.
But not in the comfort of his home, of his family's home in Fort Defiance.
No.
His older sister, his mother want to look after him and take care of him, but after about 3 weeks, Walter said no. Again, he finally found an identity being a Confederate soldier. Walter obviously didn't like slavery, but he had so many attachments to the South, but he could never find a role that he could play. He didn't enjoy being a lawyer. He didn't enjoy being a slaveholder. Okay, he was going to marry and raise a family. Well, that didn't work out. And Lincoln's call for troops gave him that identity, defender of his home and the South. But that was an identity that apparently in his mind would be undercut if he came under the care of women and was viewed as a helpless invalid. And after a few weeks, Walter moves out to the family property in the wilds of western North Carolina, lives with 8 of his slaves, on whom he is almost totally dependent for survival, and stays in those mountains until the end of the war. And as soon as it's confirmed the war's over and the slaves are free, the first thing Walter does is drive off his slaves. He's finally free of the institution in his mind.
Well, the post-war section, there are so many interesting things about this book. It really fulfills the mandate of the series, where it's a short book about a concrete, readable tale that raises all these issues.
Yeah.
One, for example, is the controversy among historians as to whether the South was defeated ultimately by a lack of will or internal dissent, as people like William Freeling or Drew Faust might argue, or if it was just beaten down militarily, as Gary Gallagher.
Militarily, as Gary Gallagher would argue.
Yeah, and this gives us insight into one particular family. where they certainly aren't defeated in spirit, but there's just no resources left.
Yeah.
The men are dead, self-inflicted wound, or Walter's leg wound. Or on the other hand, there is Rufus, who just doesn't want to go.
Walter, Rufus, no. Rufus always expected the worst. Walter always has to build up his morale during the war. But if it were up to Walter, the Confederacy would have fought almost to the last individual.
He did not want to give up. Well, and we have talked all the way to the last minute as the music comes on, much too soon as always.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Well, Bill, thank you very much for being on the show. Listeners, you will want to get a copy of this book, The Making of a Confederate, Walter Lenore's Civil War. It is a very interesting story that really personalizes some of the war's great issues. I highly recommend it. And again, Bill, thanks for being here.
Again, thank you very much for having me, Jerry.
Listeners, thank you for listening to Civil War Talk Radio.